Thank you so much. Yeah, so maybe as a kind of qualifier at the beginning, technically the paper is about quality of life. From what I understand, I think we probably have something to say about geography of well-being. That is going to depend a little bit on how we map in our minds well-being to utility. I think this is one of the rare opportunities for me to actually interact with a broader audience even including non-economists, but certainly also economists from other fields. And if you can somehow manage to get this reasonably interactive and you help me learn a little bit about how I should think about the concept of well-being in reference to space, but also in reference to what I call utility, that would be very much appreciated. I promise to try to be a little bit less technical than I would normally be. This is a fairly technical paper, but I think there are strong intuitions going in the background, which I try to emphasize here. But if you feel like, okay, I'm losing you, then I mean, interrupt me, and I try to clarify things and bring back the presentation to an intuitive level. Okay, so with that said, let me start by talking a little bit about what quality of life is in the economics literature. I guess that's important given that the paper has this quality of life theme. So my interpretation of what The Economist means when he talks about quality of life is that we take all kinds of location-specific amenities and we put them into a basket and call this quality of life. So things that go into the basket, I mean, this is really completely broad. It can be good or bad air quality, good schools, low crime rates, you name it, right? The reason why economists are first and foremost interested in this concept of quality of life is because many of these goods, clean air is just one example, right? They do not have market prices, right? So if we want to value them, we have to do something, right? And what we typically do is we try to back out, right, quantitatively, quality of life differentials. Once we have quality of life differentials, we run simple regressions against measures of amenities, like good air quality. And then we get implicit prices, and these implicit prices we then impute into social cost benefit analysis to make decisions about whether a policy that improves, for instance, good air quality is socially desirable or not. Right? So quality of life actually is a very important concept in economics because it facilitates the valuation of non-marketed goods. Now, the million-dollar question is, how do we in practice measure quality of life? This is something that has a huge tradition in economics. I mean, it goes back 200 years really to Ricardo, who came up with the idea of a compensating differential. And I think here I start relating a little bit to what in my mind it could be well-being. The idea in this literature really is very simple, right? I mean, Ricardo already started with the idea that people, hypothetically speaking, right, are perfectly mobile. So they change locations immediately if they feel that their utility falls below a certain reservation utility level, right? So you have perfect mobility, and the only way to create an equilibrium is people are equivalent, have the equivalent utility in all locations in a spatial system. Now, a question to you guys would be if it's fair to say that the assumption here is that people need to be equivalently happy or have exactly the same well-being in all locations in the city, right? But that's really what the competitive model does. It assumes that whatever goes into the utility function, eventually it needs to sum up to something that is the same across all places. This is an extremely restrictive assumption, but this is what we do. The reason why we do it is because this assumption allows us to measure quality of life indirectly via real wages. Right? So the intuition is very simple. If you have a region where you have extremely high house prices, but extremely low wages, right? The model is going to tell you, well, the only reason why we can observe this outcome in an equilibrium is because something must be amazingly great about this location so that people are willing to stay in that location, even if they get a low nominal wage and have to pay a high rent.
Hey,
right?
Gabriel.
Yeah.
It's Paul here.
Hi, Paul.
I'm sure everybody's aware of it, but you also have to add the fact that this is all subject to the income constraint. They're not equally happy if they're very, very poor.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Effectively, in this model, we're going to have 18 different groups. I mean, you can have arbitrary number of groups. So you can have rich people, poor people, old people, young people, male, female. And of course, as Paul said, in this type of model, I mean, I'm pretty sure some of you in this room will completely disagree with that. But in this model, actually, what's going to happen if you increase your income, your utility, and if you want so, your well-being increases proportionately. Right? I understand from the literature, the little I know is that probably many of you guys will feel that there are diminishing returns to income. We don't have that, but certainly richer people are always going to be happier here in this model than poorer people. Good point, Paul.
Gus is asking a question in the chat, why you're not using subjective well-being data directly.
You could do it, and people have done that. I mean, there is a paper by Jeff Lynn, who tries to do something relatively simple to what we do, right? Using subjective well-being as a proxy for utility, right? That is something that you can do if and only if you're willing to assume that these are exactly the same things. Utility is well-being, right? Now, you're going to tell me whether this is a reasonable assumption or not. I remember a presentation by Ed Glaser, for instance, and he completely disagreed with that assumption. He would argue that well-being or happiness, they are kind of inputs into the utility function. And if that is the case, then already I can't use well-being, right? So that's up for debate. I think my approach has the advantage that I can completely solve the model and deal with the model, with the problem of relaxing this assumption of having equal utility in space without needing a proxy for utility. So I think that makes, this is an attractive feature of the model, right? But in principle, you could also try to capture utility via some subjective well-being measure. Yeah. So that brings me to what we do. So what do we actually do? What is our contribution to this literature? The main contribution to literature is to move beyond the competitive spatial equilibrium framework. Again, the forceful reminder here, right? The assumption is that within income groups, right, people are perfectly mobile and therefore they have the same utility across space. That's the baseline from which we start. Here in this model, we have a dynamic model and people are not perfectly mobile, right? They are mobile, but they face mobility frictions, they face migration costs, and they also have idiosyncratic tastes for locations. That makes them immobile, and because they are immobile, we're going to actually allow for spatial differences in utility. I think that's the big thing that that we introduce into this literature, a dynamic model. The contribution that we make here, it's a technical contribution to some extent. We're going to show that it's actually possible to invert quality of life from such a dynamic spatial model if you have the suitable data. So intuitively, you need a lot more data than if you just work in the competitive spatial model. So in addition to having data on wages and rents, you also need data on bilateral migration flows, right? And that for every group that you have in your model, right? So you need a lot more data, but provided that you have the data and you buy the structure of the model, you can actually get to a quality of life, accounting for imperfect mobility, right? Big things that follow from this exercise, in general, I mean, one of the main insights that comes out of the exercise is that quality of life differences are much larger once you account for mobility frictions than if you operate in the Rose and Rollback world where you have perfect mobility. There's going to be a much larger quality of life premium than economists might have actually anticipated. And because we get larger differences in quality of life, also all these goods, right, that I mentioned that we value indirectly via quality of life, they're also going to have larger implicit prices. For you guys, I kind of suspect that what you might find interesting is that the fact that we have imperfect spatial arbitrage leads to more intuitive predictions for the effect of spatial policies. Right? To just kind of remind you about one frustrating element of the Rose and Rollback framework. In the Rose and Rollback framework, I assume, right, everybody, right, conditional on their income and characteristics is going to be equivalently well off in all places in the world. Now, if I go to a region and feel like, okay, these guys, they are struggling, it's a poor region, I somehow want to help this region. Maybe I build better infrastructure, or I just transfer some money. By assumption, in the Rosen-Rollback framework, what is going to happen is that wages and rents are going to adjust to exactly offset, right, for the benefit. So there is actually no way in which you can help a struggling region in the canonical spatial equilibrium framework. And this now changes completely here in this model, right? If I go and I take money and I throw it on a region, yes, people are going to move to that region because the region is more attractive. Yes, rents are going to go up, right? However, because people are imperfectly mobile, there are going to be less people moving into that region than you would need to completely offset, right, for the quality of life effect. And therefore, you're going to have a persistent utility effect of a spatial policy. Maybe an intuitive way of saying it, I'm not so sure I'm using these words right, but an intuitive way of just saying is that yes, with a targeted spatial policy, you can actually make people happier in a region, something that is not possible within the canonical framework, right? Yeah, that's my intro. Maybe that's a good time for you guys to ask some generic strategic questions. If not, I just continue. Okay.
I have a quick question, Gabriel.
Yeah.
So, which is out. So you've mentioned that given sort of these additional restrictions, moving costs, and so on that you're imposing, the quality of life differences are going to be larger, which will come to the result at the end. But this will also have implications. Sort of, you mentioned this for rents and for wages, right? Am I right to think that this is going to generate more dispersion in rents and wages, or less dispersion in rents and wages? Is there like an intuitive way of linking these two things? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's going to lead to more dispersion in rents. And in our model, it's going to do relatively little to wages.
Okay.
The reason is that we keep our life simple by having a one-to-one mapping from productivity into wages. So the bargaining kind of sort of element that you can have capitalization of quality of life into wages, right? Which you can have with the downward sloping labor demand curve.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have it. Labor demand is horizontal. Productivity goes straight into wages, and then quality of life conditional on wages is kind of implicitly determined by rents. So the dispersion goes into rents, not into wages. It goes a little bit into wages because it affects the city size distribution, and because we have returns to agglomeration, there is a little effect on wages, but that's small.
Okay.
So that's quite a substantial simplification in a way, isn't it? Because those frictions that you describe are also relevant in the labour market, in particular in workers' ability to procure a wage that's consistent with their productivity.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is a very significant simplification. So we assume a perfectly competitive labour market. We abstract from labour market frictions. Yes, yes. That's good to keep in the back of the mind. I'm going to state this again explicitly in one of the next slides, but it's good to be aware of that. All right, so I think the contribution is very technical. I'm going to skip the literature review to make this not too boring. Let me give you the intuitive version of the model, actually. I mean, I have these nice slides, and because not everybody in this room is an urban economist, therefore I think it's probably useful to remind or actually introduce some of you guys into some basic stylized facts of the urban economy. So a standard urban model of regions, right, would typically have something like an agglomeration force that draws people into a region. And typically this is going to be related to the labor market. You see here something that we find in our data, but which you tend to find actually almost in all spatial systems. In places where you have higher density, you tend to see greater wages. And the way we rationalize that is that you have external returns to scale, labor market pooling, input sharing, knowledge spillovers. That makes firms more productive, and this results in higher wages. And that creates an incentive for cities to grow, right? Because they become more attractive places to work, essentially. A model, in order to have an equilibrium, cannot just have an agglomeration force, it also needs a dispersion force. And the standard dispersion force we have in these models is the housing market. We have inelastically supplied land, there's just a limited amount of land. If you start building taller, it gets more expensive, right? Therefore, the more people you crowd into a city, the higher the rents are going to be, right? Don't be confused. I think I saw Clement here, right? Last time he asked me very knowledgeably, this slope seems to be lower than that slope. Something is wrong. That's not true. This scale here is 10 times as large as this one. This is 0.2. This one is 2, right? So the slope, right, here is much greater. So if you densify a city, wages go up, but rents go up a lot more than wages, right? Which is intuitive and which is also important to restore the equilibrium. Basic stylized facts. Now I show you something which is maybe slightly more related to the real mechanics in the model. I would claim that one of the big contributions that we make is that we model the process of spatial arbitrage explicitly, right? So spatial arbitrage, that's the idea that if there's something positive about the location, eventually it ends up in the real weight differential. That's usually derived by an assumption. We just say, okay, we assume that spatial arbitrage is perfect. Here in this model, right, spatial arbitrage is an endogenous process which is moderated by migration. So we are going to model migration decisions explicitly, right? Everybody in the spatial economy is going to think explicitly about how to migrate from one location to what other migration at what point in time. And basically the model is going to be focusing on causes and effects of migration. Okay, migration is going to be an effect, and you can see here some correlation that motivates this logic. I mean, what this is showing is that if I just look into regions and I look at the nominal wage in 2007, I see that people tend to migrate with a greater probability into regions that offer high nominal wages. I mean, that's really not surprising. It's just showing you that yes, migration decisions to some extent are based on economics. In the model, of course, migration decisions do not just depend on wages. They also depend on rents, and they also depend on quality of life, and they also depend on migration costs. Very importantly, now people tend to move to these places actually, which tend to be fundamentally attractive. And as they do so here, right, I can just kind of look into the net in migration over 10 years on the x-axis. As they move into these cities, right, they congest the housing market, and you can see how the property price, this is you have on the y-axis, adjusts accordingly. So there's a very strong relationship, right, between in-migration and increases in house prices. And that is essentially in the model what restores the equilibrium. At some point when a city is attractive, people keep moving into the city, but at some point this process is going to stop. And why does it stop? Because at some point rents are so high that people decide it's no longer worth going to that city. That's really the intuitive version of the model. I mean, this is maybe useful here to show you the empirical setting in which we operate is Germany. There's no particular reason why we use Germany other than that we have fantastic data. We have access to the full record of the Federal Employment Agency. This means that I can really track every socially insured German, more than 30 million, over space and time. I know exactly when and where they lived, what they earned. I have their skills, their gender, age, right? It's just beautiful data, right? And that's why we use it. But you could use the model for any other geography in any other country. And there's also absolutely no reason why, instead of just focusing on domestic migration, you couldn't focus on international migration, right? You can make this map as big as you want to, right? Migration costs are going to be larger across national borders than within, right? But the only thing that holds us back of applying this model to the whole world is data limitations. Okay, I mean, so just take Germany as an illustrative example, but there's no fundamental restriction going on here.
But under your model, are the frictions that you describe greater the more distant you conceive of moving, or
yes,
they are?
Yes. Yes, I show you. I can show this to you actually on the next slide. I mean, this is I don't have much more to say here about these maps, other than we also have some rent changes here. And what I mean, if you just kind of visually look at these regions, right? I mean, you see how changes in net migration map to greater changes in rents. I just want to quickly mention, we also have excellent rent data, 20 million housing transactions, so we can compute state-of-the-art rent indices. But let me come to your point, which is an important one. Yeah, look at this, right? So what I'm trying to do here is to kind of introduce extensive and intensive margin migration costs. In the model, I can actually compute or back out group bilateral specific migration costs. So it's not just that your migration cost is going to depend on distance. Every combination of regions and group, it's going to have its own non-parametrically identified migration costs. But if I take these non-parametrically identified migration costs and I plot them against distance, you see this very, very clear stylized fact that if people move, right, they move to regions that are closer, and that's because the migration cost is larger. The other thing that is really important here is that people really do not move that often. I mean, this is one of the striking insights actually to me. When we used an extended version of this data set, which is restricted only to West Germany, so that we can track workers over 40 years of their entire employment biography, it actually turns out that the average number of switches between local labor markets is actually just one, right? So people really do not migrate very often, although there are some differences between groups, right? As a rule of thumb, the high-skilled, they relocate more often than the low-skilled. Okay.
Ricky was asked, sorry, Gabriel, Ricky was asking in chat in terms of the demand, London versus the regions, what do you expect to happen there in terms of post-COVID and increased locational flexibility?
So the effect on what?
Sort of demand for, I think, housing in London versus the regions, how this is going to change now after COVID.
Yeah, so I have a counterfactual at the very end where I mean, it really depends on what you predict in terms of the sustainable effects of COVID. But if you trust this model, right, because this model eventually will actually load a lot of the agglomeration force onto the quality of life side, it turns out that if you believe that all social interactions would be permanently eliminated in London, this would certainly have a much more devastating effect for London as a big city than if you destroyed the positive spillovers on the production side, right? So unambiguously, if you destroy in this model returns to agglomeration, the effect will be that London is going to shrink, right? Wages are going to fall and house prices are going to fall, right? That's a prediction of the model. Now, this is a hypothetical thought experiment within the model. I can ask the model to tell me what would happen, right, if returns to density on the consumption and production side disappeared, right? If they disappear permanently, I don't know. I hope they don't, right? I really hope that we get back to a situation in which we can actually meet in person and interact without fear of health. If we can, then I can tell you that the effect, I mean, if we really go back to meeting each other in social space, and the only effect might be that we're going to meet a little bit less than before in the office, even if it reduces the productivity of workers, the effect on the spatial system will be much smaller than you would expect in a competitive model, right? In a competitive model, right, relatively small reductions in productivity are already going to mean that a lot of people move out of London. Here in this model, because many people are going to be tied to London because of idiosyncratic tastes, a lot fewer people will move out, and therefore London will stay much bigger than in the standard spatial equilibrium model. Now, of course, if you destroy all the social spillovers, then I have to say, then the model suggests that in the long run, the effect of COVID would be pretty catastrophic for London. That I can, yeah, preview maybe. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time I really should be spending on the formal parts of the model. I mean, maybe I should quickly say, just for those of you who are interested, other than the migration part, the model is pretty canonical, right? So we have a standard Cobb-Douglas utility function, quality of life shifts utility, right? We have a very simple labor market, as I said before. Labor is the only factor of production of a tradable good. There's perfect competition, so we have direct mapping from productivity into wages. However, there is endogenous and exogenous productivity, right? So some places are just going to have higher wages because they are fundamentally very productive. Some places are more productive because they have a greater population, and with a greater population, you generate greater external returns. Okay, housing is also Cobb-Douglas production function because land is inelastically supplied, as we just said, right? We're gonna map greater densities into higher lands. This is a way to motivate, to model the migration decision. Let me keep it intuitive. We are going to do a simple net present value maximization following the standard logic in financial economics. So you're going to be in a certain location I. You're going to think about to what location J should I go, and you're going to weigh the positive returns which you incur in terms of utility or well-being flows in the future. You're going to weigh the discounted aggregate of these returns against a one-off migration cost, which is this tau parameter here, which is group location specific, right? And then you're going to be, more likely, of course, to go to places which offer a high utility and less likely to go to places where you have a high migration cost. And then there's also an idiosyncratic component, which is really, really important. Workers, they have different tastes, right? Some people are more attached to places than others, right? And that also, as we see next, is going to create, after you maximize the standard problem, right, following literature in the tradition, McFadden, you get to these conditional migration probabilities, and maybe that's actually the equation that you want to keep in mind. Okay, so what this equation tells you, I mean, that's something which is actually fairly standard in the spatial literature. We have originally used these gravity models for trade, then we've done them for commuting, and now I do them for migration, but the mechanics are relatively straightforward. What this equation tells you is a probability of a worker of a certain group to migrate from region I to region J. And what I want to stress here is that in this V, I have put the fundamental factors, and they are wages, rents, and quality of life. So the probability to go location J is going to increase if this location J offers a high wage or a low house price or a high quality of life. Okay, so these are the kind of pull factors to a location J.
What information does the actor have about quality of life in different locations other than wages and house prices?
No, I mean, this model, the actor actually observes quality of life, right? So we assume that you observe quality of life, you understand the quality of life in all regions. And because workers understand what the quality of life differences in all regions is, only because of that assumption, we can look into observed wages, observed rents, and observed migration flows to then conclude on the differences in quality of life, right? So this is an assumption in this model. In this model, people are incredibly smart, right? And this model, it's gonna, I mean, we've been pushed actually towards that. Initially, for the macro guys, our workers were not even actually smart enough when we made them know everything about the distribution of quality of life. What we were pushed to actually is to also actually make sure that our workers know all the evolution of future changes in wages and rents, right? Because in the dynamic literature, people actually want workers to be as smart as possible, because otherwise they're going to blame you for solving a problem by making your agents stupid. So here,
in this sense, then the frictions are not informational at all.
No, very good point. Absolutely. Yeah. This is the assumption we make, that actually it's not an information friction. It's purely some kind of social capital that you lose when you migrate and you have to rebuild it. It's a very good point, because I think there is a model to be written in which you have uncertainty, right, as a migration cost, right? And then you might actually have to do something like an implicit risk return kind of optimization in your migration decision, where you say that also you may not go to places if you are less likely to know something about those places. It's something that could be done and maybe should be done, but it's not what we're doing here. So here the migration costs, I really just think of them as being lost social capital, which has to be reconstructed.
Probably becomes less important over time, right? I mean, currently these days you can sort of more observe, you know, how regions really are in which you're sort of moving. So I think this, yeah, information is more readily available these days. No?
Yeah, it would be actually interesting to see how these migration costs evolve over time to test your hypothesis. What I can tell you is that, I mean, I can over-identify my migration costs that I identify with all sorts of things. For instance, there's an incredibly powerful exercise where I just correlate these migration flows with spatial linkages in Facebook, right? And you can really see that, I mean, on routes where you have a lot of linkages in Facebook, you also have low migration costs. Not going to talk about the direction of causality, but I mean, it's certainly suggestive, right? That there could be a channel, right? Very, very interesting, right? So, and you could totally hypothesize that rebuilding social capital gets cheaper over time, as we have better and better kind of digital technologies that complement offline interaction. Yeah, and that would actually be an interesting exercise that you could do in the model. How will the equilibrium change as we reduce migration costs, right? It's actually something we did in the prior version of the paper, but now the paper has 120 pages, so we've taken out some of these counterfactuals because it's just too much.
Another distraction, Gabriel, from Paul. I mean, there was a literature back in the 1960s, migration literature, which concentrated on the so-called friends and neighbors effect, which was essentially about the information costs of migration. And that was showing, for example, that people even from the same village in Scandinavian countries ended up in the same township in the US when they migrated.
Yeah, because they just kind of went to meet their peers essentially there, right?
They had information flows coming back, but they also, of course, lowered the lost fixed costs of social capital in their place of origin. They could get select fish when they arrived.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's also amazing how much persistence we find in the spatial distribution of these migration flows. So if I have this Facebook, right, the Facebook measure of social connectedness today, but I can also use the data from Stefan Hebelich on historic dialects, right, in Germany. So dialect similarity established hundreds of years ago, and this kind of dialect similarity, even conditional on distance, is still an incredibly strong predictor of Facebook connections today, right? You take out the distance effect, right? But where you had historic social ties, you still have them today. It's amazing. I mean, and it's all correlated with our migration flows, by the way. But I mean, I agree with you, Paul. So these things, they likely matter, and they matter probably a lot. Good. So what else do I want to tell you about the model? Maybe the last
one quick question. Yeah? Sorry, Gabriel, about the migration flows here. So about this conditional migration probability. So is this like conditional on migrating? I'm just trying to understand here, because a lot of people are not going to move anywhere, right?
Yeah, but I was about to talk about that, right?
Okay,
I mean, that's a very, very, very important point. I literally want to talk about it now. So the conditional migration probabilities, they sum to 1. Everybody migrates, but, that's a huge but, because the distribution of migration costs is incredibly skewed, because the migration cost of staying in your region is 0, what turns out is that about 95% or so kind of migrate, but then migrate to the origin, i.e. they do not migrate. So technically in the model, to just run the model, everybody migrates, but effectively only about 5% or even less, sometimes depends on the region, right? It's all kind of inverted, but depending on the region, you can have between 3 to 7 people actually leaving the region, and the rest is just going to stay. right? And the nice thing about putting it this way, right, just having it actually in one set of migration probabilities and not playing around with extensive and intensive margin, is that I can very, very easily just compute the distribution of population in the next period. Because all I have to do is I have to take these migration probabilities, I multiply them with the initial population, that gives me a migration flow. And if I sum all these flows at the destination, I have the population at the place in the next period. And this allows me to compute then the wages in the next period, the prices in the next period. And so I can iterate the model forward, right, and can really back out the dynamic adjustment path, right, and all these variables over time. Yeah, I think that's probably what I want to tell you about the model. I mean, maybe I can quickly mention here that one of the nice things about this model is that I rationalize the data as an equilibrium in a world where some regions shrink and grow. Standard model assumes perfect mobility. So you're always in a stationary spatial equilibrium. There's nothing like growing or shrinking regions in an equilibrium. Here, an equilibrium has all kinds of market clearing conditions, but the migration market actually doesn't have to be clear. I can have a world in which regions grow and shrink, just like in the real world, and this can still be an equilibrium. And the classic spatial equilibrium that we have, which is a stationary spatial equilibrium, here is a counterfactual. I can get to the situation asking the model to just kind of predict future adjustment paths, right? At some point, spatial arbitrage is going to come to a stop. Regions are going to become stationary and then have a nice stationary spatial equilibrium, but it's a counterfactual, not an observed situation in the data, which is kind of nice if you are in spatial equilibrium models.
Can you also calculate as a counterfactual how much welfare is lost by sort of having these frictions and immobility from the sort of like perfect spatial equilibrium?
Yeah, that's so asking the question, what would happen if I remove the migration friction? Yes, I can compute that relatively easily. Yeah, I've done it in the past. We no longer have it in the paper now, but it's possible. Yeah. So what would happen here? Some things would be counterintuitive because the migration costs, they actually to some extent act as an agglomeration force. I think if you completely got rid of migration costs, you would have a slightly more balanced population. And therefore, you would have slightly lower wages because you would have lower agglomeration economies, but you would have higher utility, right? Of course, you would move towards a world in which welfare would be increasing.
Could I just ask a sort of quick technical question? So this is a dynamic discrete choice model, which ever since, Rust 94, he said these models are generically unidentified. And then there are various tricks to bring identification in. And I'm not quite sure which of those tricks you are using here, which assumption you're using here.
Yeah, so this is, wow, that's a massive question, right? So there are, when you talk about identification of these models, there are two stages. The first stage is you need to estimate the structural parameters. The second stage is you need to invert the fundamentals. So for the estimation of the structural parameters, there's actually not much of a trick. Well, there's a trick. There is a trick, and the trick is the Bellman equation, right? So this is something that we know from Artuch et al. And then Caliendo and co-authors have done that. Right. So basically, to deal with these kind of forward-looking expectations, you have to kind of load all these future expectations onto migration probabilities in the next period, which you can observe, right? And that allows you to estimate this migration elasticity. So the Bellman.
Sorry, could I just? I mean, we shouldn't dwell on this, but that isn't the Rust critique at all. But I think looking at that table, you've answered the question because you've set the discount rate.
Yes. I see. Okay, sorry. I got it. Yeah. So we have set the discount rate. Absolutely. Yeah. And this is true, right? I mean, so to just kind of elaborate on where I was, right? So if you then, I mean, I think it's kind of related because Caliendo et al. Exactly in this type of Bellman setting try to estimate the discount rate, right? But they kind of give up, right? And they say that actually it's basically not identifiable, right? And we just set it because indeed, I mean, it doesn't work out, right? Very, very good point. Yeah, I talk about the inversion in a minute. I mean, it's painful. I mean, the quantification, to be absolutely clear in these type of models, is painful, not just with respect to the discount rate. So this is just to say, I mean, that we have good data, right? I mean, I think I said everything I wanted to say about the data. For the estimation, the discount rate, yes, we have to calibrate it. We also calibrate the expenditure share in housing because I think that's very easy to calibrate. You just look into the national statistics and then you have a number. All the other parameters we estimate. Not going to go into details because we really just follow what we believe are best practice examples in the literature in terms of identification. All moment conditions follow from the microstructure of the model. The one important novelty I think that we have here is because we have such cool data, we can estimate many of these parameters for 18 different groups. So we get distributions of parameter values rather than point estimates as you see them in the literature. That's the one reason why you want to look into the appendix if you're interested in these estimates.
Sorry, just a minute. While we were still looking at the previous table, you show that you estimate migration cost elasticities with the range of values. So do you do it for different demographics or for different? Okay.
Yes. So we do it. So all these migration costs, they are gender, age, group, and skill specific. 18.
And if kind of on an intuitive level, do they come from the fact which costs would explain the current patterns of migration, or so where does the identification come from fundamentally for the migration costs?
This is it has two ingredients. One is the gravity migration equation. You observe for every group the full matrix of bilateral migration flows. Then you do what people do in the trade literature. You add origin fixed effects, destination fixed effects, right? And then the origin destination pair, right? That's fixed effect because we have 25 years of data. The origin destination time invariant fixed effect, that's our migration resistance. Mm-hmm. To go from migration resistance to migration cost, you also need an estimate of this gamma, right? This is the migration elasticity. This comes from this kind of Bellman equation trick that we borrow from Artuch. And then when you have the migration resistance plus this gamma, then you can back out the migration cost. So the procedure is relatively involved, but so what essentially you actually need a full set of data to do it. You need wages and you need rents and you need bilateral migration flows to eventually actually get to the migration cost.
And in terms of taste, it's just a shock, right? So
yeah, the taste matters in the model in the sense if a group has very strong tastes for particular locations, then relatively large differences in wages, prices, and quality of life will be required for migration responses. So essentially from observing actually how quickly groups respond to migration incentives, i.e. different wages in particular, we can back out the idiosyncrasy of tastes by group. So if you have some people where you have a small difference in wage and that's enough for a lot of people to migrate, you know they don't care so much about location. That's the intuition.
Indeed.
Yeah. You know, this all may sound complicated, but the real complicated part, if you want to invert this model, is actually the inversion of the quality of life itself, which is, I think, the reason why people haven't done it so far, right? I mean, it's complicated. I try to give you the intuition in 1 minute and then I move ahead, right? Because this is probably just interesting for me because I spend so much time on it. The problem is, in very simple terms, a dynamic model, right? If I have quality of life differences and all the other stuff, right? I can predict the future evolution of population, wages, and prices, right? At the same time, if I have future wages, prices, and population, I can actually relatively easily invert quality of life. But you see, there is a circularity problem, right? And we didn't find a magic solution to the problem other than a brute force complicated algorithm which treats future wages, future prices, future population, and quality of life as one nested fixed point problem, right? And yeah, it solves within a finite time. I should say it takes a long time, but it's a finite time, right? And yeah. The good thing is eventually you can solve for the stationary spatial equilibrium. We get for every region all the adjustment paths and employment and wages and rents. We have changed in skill composition, and we need to do this, right? Because our agents have to be smart. They have to be able to anticipate all of these changes, right? So in anticipation, assuming that residents perfectly anticipate all these future changes, we then actually back out a theory consistent quality of life measure as you want to have it in the dynamic model, according to people who have been working on dynamic models much longer than myself. Okay, and I think now we should really move to some results, right? I want to just show you what comes out of the model, right? I mean, if we do the standard thing, right, Rosen-Rohrbeck, or we do what we do in the dynamic spatial model. So you see here the distribution of quality of life. And I've put these two maps, and that might not be so easy to see, on exactly the same legend, right? So these categories here are exactly the same. So the takeaway from the comparison of these two maps is that actually the distribution of quality of life is relatively similar, whether you do Rosen-Rohrbeck or whether you do our approach. However, the dispersion here is much greater. You have a lot darker colors here on our map, and also a lot more light shaded colors, whereas you don't have them in the Rosen-Rohrbeck.
Stupid question, Gabriel. Why do you have in Rosen-Rohrbeck then? I mean, shouldn't it be completely, I mean, homogeneous? Shouldn't there any differentials at all?
Yeah, beautiful question. The answer is you're thinking about utility. I'm talking about quality of life. So again, the reminder, utility is constant, right? But quality of life differs. And just inversely related to how quality of life differs, real wages differ. So what actually you see here on this map is basically nothing else than the inverse of the real wage. So in Hamburg and Munich, you have relatively low real wages. This is why, under the assumption that utility is constant, they must be high quality of life areas, right? But the utility map would be completely flat, as you said, right? So this is quality of life, and quality of life actually is not utility. It's an input into utility and well-being. Yeah, so I mean, basically this stylized facts, right? I mean, that you get a much greater dispersion. I mean, you get it for all 18 different groups, right? As I mentioned to you, the implication is that in our model, the value of pollution is much larger, for instance, than if you use Rosen-Rohrbeck. I mean, opera houses we find an effect. You don't find it in Rosen-Rohrbeck, and the table in the paper is much longer. I just keep this simple here. But unless you're super interested in the quality of life differences here, or you have an important question about that, I would probably go to the counterfactual, because then I can talk a little bit about this question of a uniform colored map that you just brought up, right? But the big takeaway here is really, I mean, if people are imperfectly mobile, right, you need much greater differences in quality of life to rationalize observed differences in wages and prices. That's really the main takeaway here, right? I think it's actually fairly intuitive, right? But it's still a very important insight, I would say. But yeah, but let me now move on to the counterfactual, which is going to be a simple counterfactual here. I can basically do a counterfactual for anything I want, because the model is fully inverted. So unlike in dynamic spatial models in the spirit of Caliendo, where you use dynamic head algebra and you can only estimate a subset of parameters and some fundamentals you cannot invert, here I estimate all parameters and I invert all fundamentals. Now I can change anything in the model that I want. I can change the local productivity. I can change the productivity of the housing market. Paul would be interested in what happens if we make the housing market more productive because we relax planning regulations. I can do that, right? I can change migration costs as suggested by Christian. But what I'm going to do here is because the paper is about quality of life, I'm going to shock quality of life. And I'm going to shock quality of life. I spare you the details of how we estimate this relationship between quality of life and pollution. Yeah, just believe me, it's supposed to be causal. But what I'm doing here, I'm trying to improve as a policymaker the quality of life in the most polluted regions in Germany by reducing the pollution level, right? So the idea is something like the US Clean Air Act, right? I mean, you kind of put something like a top coding into the pollution distribution, which you deem socially acceptable. And then some regions that are beyond that, they somehow have to find ways to get the pollution down. I'm not going to talk about the costs of this policy. I'm just purely interested in the effects of this policy on utility, or as you would call it, maybe well-being, right? But this is very interesting. We have the standard scenario here. A policymaker wants to do something good to the region. The regions that are being positively treated here are those dark colored regions, right? So Bochum, for instance, gets the biggest shock, right? Many regions do not get any shock at all because they are not very polluted in the initial situation. So what happens? Well, some regions are now more attractive. People start migrating to these regions. As they migrate to these regions, they congest the housing market, house prices go up, okay? So far, you could say that's the standard Rosen-Robeck story, right? I mean, we know that. Why are you making such a fuss out of it? Well, the fuss is now here on the right map, which goes to Chris' point. The big point here is that in Rosen-Robeck, right, where I'm now plotting the change in utility, or maybe you can call this change in well-being or change in happiness. In Rosen-Robeck, this is the map that would have just one color, as you said, right? Nothing would change, right? Quality of life would change, yes. But the well-being wouldn't change. Why wouldn't the well-being not change? Well, because rents would go up so much that people, after they experience this increase in house prices, would say, well, look, I mean, I'm not gaining anything from the reduction in pollution if I have to pay that much more in terms of housing costs, right? I mean, that just doesn't make me better off. But that standard conclusion is based on the assumption that mobility is frictionless. And now that we have introduced actually frictions into the model, what happens is that the cities that experience the positive quality of life shock, they grow less than in the standard Rosen-Robeck model. Therefore, also the increase in house prices is smaller. And therefore, there is a residual positive utility or well-being effect. And this is what I mean by one of the big punchlines of the paper, maybe for you guys, that although sometimes economists may tell you that actually it's not possible really to improve the situation of people by means of place-based policies, once you have a frictional model, it's actually possible. So I think that's pretty cool, and it's pretty important, right?
Does this say something about like inequality in utility amongst the population?
Yeah, there is going to be a lot of, yes. So there are a lot of sorting effects going on here. And there is a distributional effect. And as a rule of thumb, the distributional effect of a positive place-based policy is going to be regressive, right? And the reason why it is regressive is that everybody is competing on the same housing market. But as the city grows, the high-skilled get a greater return in terms of wages, right? So what's happening here, I improve quality of life. This quality of life shock leads to in-migration. First, it's already going to be more high-skilled to migrate into the city, A, because high-skilled care more about amenities, B, high-skilled are more mobile. So you're going to have high-skilled coming into the city. These high-skilled are going to benefit from the increase in city size through an agglomeration effect. And this agglomeration effect for the high-skilled is greater than for the low-skilled. But the low-skilled, right, they have to compete on the same housing market, right? So they experience an increase in rents, the same increase in rent as the high-skilled, but the increase in wage is lower, right? So the distributional effect within the city is regressive, right? Now, you may still have a progressive distributional effect overall if you target the poor region, right? So I would argue that if you go to a poor region, right, and you just kind of transfer a lot of money to a poor region, right, then the the progressive between region effect is very likely to dominate the within region regressive effect. Yeah. But I can actually talk about that fairly explicitly, right? I mean, that's just to show you that I have this dynamic model where you can even see how the well-being effect is going to evolve over time, right? You see here how people, this is Bochum on the left-hand side, where I improved air quality a lot. What happens is that well-being goes up, right, by 6% for, I think blue is male and red is female. You get a higher shock for female than male workers because female workers seem to care more about pollution. And then over time, as people move into Bochum, rents go up, right? Wages also go up a little bit. They go up actually more for female than for male workers. And then the well-being declines a little bit again because rents go up, but they stay eventually positive, right? Something that is cool in this general equilibrium model is that you can account for these kind of spatial spillovers. I've done nothing really to treat Munich. Munich has always had a good air quality. There's no direct treatment of Munich. The only reason why Munich receives a treatment is because people are leaving Munich because some other places are now more attractive. And that also makes the life of people in Munich better, right? Because people in Munich, they experience initially very high house prices. As some people leave Munich, house prices go down. Wages also go down a little bit, but the effect on house prices dominates so that utility goes up, right? And you see already here, I've done this for male and female, but I can also do it for high skilled, low skilled, young, old, right? That's all in the model. And then you can also aggregate it up.
I think we have only like 1 minute left, actually.
Okay, I stop here. Sorry for that, right? But just to say here, there you see, I've computed the welfare effect actually discounting for equality, and and if I discount for inequality effects, the welfare effect of this policy is a bit lower. So here, indeed, you have a regressive welfare effect. Yeah, sorry for going over time. Really, I mean, yeah, I should stop here, right? I
mean. Yes, I think so. Maybe we can take a couple of more questions. I think it was really fascinating. And it's also to see how close actually, and yet maybe distinct certain components and or aspects we talk about, like quality of life, utility, and well-being. But there's definitely connections here.
Give me your thoughts. I mean, if you can spare a minute, actually telling, I mean, any of you guys, I mean, who are in the welfare literature, how is utility, well-being, and quality of life? How do these guys relate in your minds? I will be really interested because I talked to you a lot about how I view about that.
Yeah, so when we talk about, well-being, we talk about subjective well-being, and it depends a little bit on who you're talking to, but we talk about life satisfaction, which we simply measure in terms of, 0 to 10 Likert scale, how satisfied are you with your life, all things considered. And, many people in the field see this as a proxy for utility, right? And then there's the question, I mean, it's an ongoing discussion whether it's sort of like the same as utility or whether it's different. So Ed Glaser, as you said, says it's a component of the utility function, amongst other things like income, observing that people actually do move to places which are unhappy and sort of for higher income. Sort of they do, what he argues, make these implicit trade-offs or explicit trade-offs. So that's an ongoing discussion. And quality of life for us is then also pretty much equatable with that. Maybe includes other components of well-being. I mean, there are different concepts like eudaimonia, for example, the worthwhileness of what you do in your life. But for you, it seems to be much more amenity, disamenity based than what we would think in terms of our language. So for you, it's really an input into the utility function, quality of life. That is amenities and disamenities, a basket of it. For you, it's simply like the residual, which you take out of regressions, but it's actually a basket of things that come into the utility function. And then basically you had this graph. Now, if you go one slide back maybe, or 2 slides back, here, this one. So you have quality of life on the left-hand side, which is your amenity shock. Here, air pollution. That then you have sort of like the mechanism why just movement over space, why actually this leads to a change in the equilibrium. And then you have this persistent utility effect where you sort of go back to Rohrbeck-Rosen and Rosen-Rohrbeck, right? And for us, I mean, if we observe, I mean, it's fascinating. We did a very similar graph for Germany where we plotted life satisfaction, simply life satisfaction. People's self-evaluation, how they feel about their lives, across space, also across counties, Landkreise. And we also had these persistent effects, differences between even very close, well, there were clusters, but even close adjacent Landkreise, counties, where there were huge differences in life satisfaction, persistent over time. I mean, kind of similar to your persistent utility effects here. So, I mean, that this by no means, means that it's sort of like the same thing. Can also still be that it's different, but I think there's sort of like connections here which are really interesting.
So if well-being really is a proxy for utility, then this would mean that your results could only be rationalized in a model with migration frictions, right? Otherwise,
I mean, yeah, for me also, it would never be, I mean, for me, of course, there must be frictions in a way. I mean, in terms of that people, may not afford to go somewhere else, or, I mean, yeah, I mean, exactly, there must be frictions. Yeah. Or what we look into, I mean, Katja and Rete Odermatt, we look into like the moving decision particularly, and we see that people actually mispredict what makes them happy. So they mispredict their life satisfaction in the future before making a moving decision. So they move actually to places which, doesn't make them happy at all. And then, of course, that also adds to the differences over time. We don't really know how big the effect is. I mean, as a friction compared to the other frictions, but it's one component too. That people do not know what actually makes them happy in a place. I mean, it sort of goes back to the information argument, but they also may not know themselves really what makes them happy. So they might be imperfectly informed about their preferences.
Yeah. So exactly the opposite of the dynamic macro person who wants to have these super smart people who can correctly anticipate everything. I would say that maybe there is a reason to believe that people are very imperfectly informed. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And just being back to the size of friction, Gabriel, could you please speak a bit about the size of these costs, for example, compared to wages? So the costs which you estimate, how dramatic they are compared to either to wages or to rent a year or something, just for us to understand the scale, what are the costs that keeping people in place that can rationalize?
Okay, but this is, so how would I, so the migration cost is very, very large. I think I have the numbers on the paper where I monetize them. Now, as I said, 120 pages, right? I mean, and sometimes these numbers change. I do remember one number, which is 150,000 euros, right? Now I'm not, the problem where I struggle now, I can't quite picture in my mind which group this was. And of course, these numbers, they vary significantly across groups, right? One of those groups has a migration cost somewhere in the range of 150,000. It turns out that if you compare that to the best stated preference research I know from the US, right? Then our implied monetized moving costs, they tend to be a little bit larger than what they find actually, but this could also be because Germany is different than the US, but they don't seem to be crazy, and I think something like a low 6-digit amount for certainly a middle or high scale group. I mean, that's somewhere actually I think where we put it.
Thank you. So
they're quite sizable.
Yeah, it takes a lot to explain why people don't move, right? Like it takes a lot of money to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you think about these moving costs as really what it costs actually to kind of have a company shipping, putting your stuff from A to B. I mean, it's really the thing that you're going to have to kind of rebuild your social ties and everything in a new city, right? That's
yeah,
the way
I'm not thinking about it as kind of what amount of money I should be willing to sacrifice. So what amount of money would rationalize my decision to move? Like what would explain the fact that, let me try to phrase it again. So if I know I'm better in the other location, how much money somebody should give me so that I stay in my current one? Is it kind of that intuition?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think I guess the intuition is how much, yeah. So how much money do I need to get actually in order to stay in my location. If it actually was more profitable to go somewhere else, that's the way how you want to think about it. And if you I mean, the point is these numbers have to be large, because if you expect to stay at the destination for a long time, right, then it's the kind of the nature of the financial modeling, right, that you need relatively large investments to compensate for small increases in returns. Yeah. So I'm not so surprised to see in something in the range of 6 digits, to be honest.
Thank you.
Gabriel, sorry, it's Gus. Could I come in?
Please.
Just, I'd be intrigued. I mean, it seems to me that the costs of moving are, as you said, mostly to do with losing friends, family, neighborhood effects, all sorts of things that you've got close by. And that often the reason that people are moving is because they've lost their job. So there's a very, there's an exogenous shock, as it were, as opposed to this sort of idea that they're trying to equalize rents and all the rest of it. Can you test at all the extent to which migration flows actually follow those kind of shocks to the labor market? I know you've got perfect labor markets in there, which worries me, to be honest.
Yeah, but I can only give you my honest answer. These quantum spatial models are complicated. At least if you're not much smarter than me, right? So I have another model where everything else is frictionless, but we built for the first time a monotonistic labor market. That is also already extremely complicated. But then in this model, I can start talking about the frictions in the labor market, right? I can also start thinking about what happens if I introduce a minimum wage and these cool things, right? But that's really, really, really complicated. This year, even with the perfect labor market, is already, I mean, at least for me, really complicated. Maybe I'm gonna learn a lot over the next years, and at some point I can put these two models together. That would be perfect. But until I get there, and unfortunately, I have to just kind of be upfront with the limitations, right? I wouldn't be able to quantify that model, although I think it is very important what you say. Yeah, so I don't have a great answer, unfortunately.
I think we are now 9 minutes over time. I think one last question though. Ricky has left already, but we're recording this, so you can actually see this on the recording. And he wanted to ask still, how your model would pan out if, in a post-COVID world where work from home would be normal and wages are decoupled from location. So how would that?
So this is the counterfactual exercise that I ran, right? The question I asked the model is, so what would happen, right, if I destroyed all the returns to agglomeration? That's relatively easy to do, right? I set the agglomeration elasticities to 0. There is no productivity boost from being in a specific location anymore because we can zoom, right? And it doesn't really matter where we are, right? If I do this here, right, I can just kind of look into what happens to big and small cities, right? And you can see that big cities are going to lose a lot more in terms of GDP than the small cities. But I mean, it's not like a catastrophic shock, right? Now, if I do the quality of life shock, here it's a bit more complicated. I mean, to get to that, I have to use social media, right, to get proxies for how often people need to interact, right? If you trust what I did, right, and I reduce now the social interactiveness to the lowest level I observed across German regions, right? There you can see that big cities really take massive hits, right? Because they are these places where all these endogenous amenities like bars, restaurants, museums, art galleries are, where people are meeting, right? So if I switch off, right, that consumption side agglomeration effect, you see that large local labor markets, they lose a lot more in terms of GDP because they lose a lot more people. And then for the small local labor market, actually, it's going to be a positive effect because all these people who leave the big cities have to go somewhere. They go to the small cities, so these small cities even grow. So the consumption shock is significant, and it would really revert the fortunes of cities. Small cities would gain at the expense of big cities. The productivity shock in comparison would push in that direction, but the magnitude, the impact would be a lot smaller, right? So I think the idea that only because we can meet to work on Zoom, right, that is not going to kill the big city. Only if we, at some point, we're willing to say, you know what, even having a social gathering over Zoom is as good as having it in the real world. Only then, I think, then the big city might really come actually to an end.
Okay, I think we're not there yet.
Not quite,
It
right?
doesn't feel like it. Okay.
That's also my impression, but
all right. I think we really have to close. Gabriel, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. We do have a small break next week, but then afterwards we do have Tom Kirchmeier from the LSE as well, from the CEP, on the 20th of May, who will be talking about crime in local areas and well-being. And we hope to see many of you there, not next week, but the week after. Gabriel, thank you so much. And well, take care, everybody.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be in your seminar. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.